I'd invite you to turn in your Bibles, Matthew 26, and we'll look at verses 36 through 46. And in doing this, we're going to spend a little time with Jesus when he was in the garden. Now, we're going to change the order of services just a little bit. And I want you to look at this. We did something like this previously. And we want to do things decently and in order. So pay attention to the order of services. Usually after the sermon closes with an invitation. But instead this morning, when we conclude the sermon, we're going to sing Night with Ebon, Pinion. That number is what, Mike? 452. So turn to 452. And immediately after the sermon, we'll sing that song, and then we'll have the Lord's Supper. Now, when the Lord's Supper is over, I'll then extend an invitation, and we'll have our invitation song. All right? So that's how we're going to do things this morning, and I think you'll appreciate that change when you get into the subject matter of the sermon this morning. Let's read the text. Matthew 23, verses 36 through 39. Beginning, and then we'll go on through 46. Then cometh Jesus with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said unto the disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then said he to them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And he went a little further, and fell on his face, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And he cometh to his disciples, and findeth them asleep, and said unto Peter, What? Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away the second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then cometh he to his disciples and said unto them, Sleep on now, and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Arise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. All right, let's go over this again and look at some of the details here. Jesus had come to a place called Gethsemane. That word means the olive press. Gethsemane was where an olive press was. It's on the Mount of Olives. And so there would be olive trees around, and other accounts. I'm not going to go into detail here and what Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John say. I'm going to kind of stick with Matthew, but in the other accounts it's called the Garden of Gethsemane. So I take it was a tended place around that olive press, and it was also a place where Jesus had been to pray before. It says he was wont or known to go to this place to pray. So Jesus is there at the old olive press with the olive trees around on the Mount of Olives. And so he said to his disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. Now that's the King James Version. The King James Version uses words like that, yonder. And you can read the bulletin to find out a little bit about that. Sometimes people, they hear where I've lived all over this country. I've been everywhere. And And sometime when I would talk, people would act like they were surprised to hear me talk. I'd say, well, it's over yonder, and they act like they didn't know what that was. Well, we know words like that, don't we? I really think one of the reasons that so many of you still read the King James Version of the Bible is because of those old words that are in it like that. We've heard those words all our lives. We don't stumble over those words like some people do because we know those words. And like I've said in the bulletin, you know, when I hear this old book read, it just sounds like our book. And so it says he took with him, went to pray on, he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee. And we know who they were. That's James and John. Peter, James, and John. Of the 12 apostles, Jesus kind of picked Peter, James, and John as kind of special among the others, and that he would take them places and show them things that he didn't show all of his apostles. Remember when he went to heal Jairus' daughter and raise her from the dead? He took Peter, James, and John. Remember when he went up onto the mountain? He was transfigured before them. It wasn't to all of the apostles. It's to Peter, James, and John. And so those three, he took the apostle. Judas had left. That means there were 11. And so he took them all, and he had 8 of them stay here. He took Peter, James, and John, 3 of them a little further, and then he himself goes a little further by himself. So this is what's happening here at the Olive Press. And then Jesus began to be sorrowful and very heavy. And that is such a good description of sorrow, isn't it? Sorrow can be hard to bear. But you think about being heavy with sorrow. And we sing a song, "Oh, hearts bowed down with sorrow." Now, my Jesus, my Lord, he would see others, people grieve, and he would grieve with them. And when I think about my Lord being heavy with sorrow, listen, I love him, and I grieve with him. You ever heard someone say, it just hurts so bad I could just die? And it says Jesus was exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. That's what he said. Now, we bear with grief in our life where we just are exceeding sorrowful. And when that happens, I want you to remember this. Jesus knows how you feel. When you feel like you can't bear up under those sorrows, he's been there. He's touched with the feelings of our infirmities, having been tried in all points, just as we are. And you remember that now. So he's in this garden. He's exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. And he said, "Tarry ye here and watch with me." And then he went a little farther. So he goes out here to be by himself with his Father. But he wants his friends close. He wants them to watch with him. What are they to watch for? Well, things are going to happen that night. He wants them to be on guard. Let them be on guard now. I want to spend some time talking to my Father. And he fell on his face. Now, I've seen pictures of Jesus in the garden. I actually got on the computer and Googled this. You know, you can Google something and then look at images. So I Googled Jesus in the garden, Jesus praying in the garden. I Googled that, and then I went to images. And there were all these pictures of Jesus in the garden. And I've seen a lot of these pictures before, and you may have seen some. It's got Jesus, and he's in the garden, and he's on his knees, and he's got his hands clasped together pretty intently, you know. And he's leaning on a rock, And he's looking up to heaven as he prays. I didn't see anyone draw a picture of Jesus on his face. You see, it's that painting, it's a beautiful painting, but that's not what happened. Jesus goes in the garden and he falls on his face. It's as though he is so heavy with sorrow, he can't stand. And he kneels down, and he can hardly bear up under it. And he puts his face down to the ground as he prays. It's just about as low can be. So he fell on his face and prayed, saying, and as he prays, he says this. He says, "Oh, my Father." Look how he says that, "Oh." Doesn't that just express the emotion that he is feeling at this time? "Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." Now, let's go to see what happens next. He cometh to his disciples and findeth them asleep. And he said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation." Now there's some rebuke in those language. You couldn't even stay awake for this hour while I was praying? Now, he tells us here how to avoid temptation, doesn't he? Let's notice that. You ever tempted? Well, here's how you avoid temptation. You watch and pray. Now don't let your guard down. You see, a lot of people think, well, temptation, I've dealt with that, I can handle it, and then they let their guards down, and that's when you're going to be tempted. Just don't ever let your guard down. Know that the devil is trying his best to find some way to get you to fall into this temptation, so watch and then pray. If you'll pray, you won't sin. See? It'll remind you of the thing, you'll be in touch with your Father, and it'll help you avoid temptation. So he said, watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. But then look what he says next. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. You see, Jesus knows about us. He knows. And he knows a lot of the time we want to do things and we just can't seem to do it. Or we don't want to do things and we just seem to fall into it. And he knows what's in our hearts. He knows the spirit is willing. I tell you, he also knows the flesh is weak. And I know when he said this, he's thinking of his disciples. But it makes me wonder, could he have been thinking of himself as well? Because see, Jesus is willing to go through this for us. He loves us and he loves his Father and he's willing to do it. But here this night in the garden, he is weak. And so when our spirit is willing and our flesh is weak, I want you to remember this. Jesus understands that. Okay? So he went away a second time and prayed, saying, and here it is again, "Oh, my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me except I drink it, thy will be done." And it just sounds to me that there's a little more resolution here in this second prayer than it was there in the first. And then we read this. He came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Now this time he didn't wake them up. He just let them sleep. And I think Matthew 26:44 may be one of the most lonely verses in all the Bible. Look what happens. Imagine this now. And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words, all by himself. And those friends and those disciples whom he loved, they might sleep. He knew his Father wasn't asleep. He would hear his prayer. So he goes by himself, just he and his Father. And then it says, then cometh he to his disciples and said to them, sleep on now and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Now that's right in the middle of verse 46, right there. But I'd stop right there. If I were dividing the scriptures up into verses, I would have stopped 46 right there, because some time takes place here. He comes back and they're asleep, and he says something they don't even hear, because see, they're asleep. But he says, sleep on and take your rest. The hour is at hand. Remember how he'd said earlier, mine hour is not yet come? Well, it's come now. The hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Now, use your imagination again. I want you to imagine Jesus sitting on that hillside up by that olive press. And all those apostles have gone to sleep. He's alone. He's awake. And he's waiting. He can see across the little Kidron Valley, back up the hill to the gate of Jerusalem. And there the men are gathering, lighting their torches, and they start coming down that road. They're going to come down, across that Kidron Valley, and then up that hill, and that's where it's going to begin. They'll arrest him there. So he's watching this in that silence. And then as they make their approach, he says to his disciples, arise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. And I can see Jesus stepping out from that spot in the garden to meet this mob that has come to arrest him. Now there's a song that we sing about this, and that's what we're going to sing here at the end of the service. And I want us to look at this song. We know words like yonder, don't we? I mean, those are easy words. We know those. This song has some words in it that we don't use very much, and we might miss the meaning sometimes. So you may have heard this explained, but listen to it again. It's just beautiful the way this poet captured what took place that night. He begins night with Ebon, Pinion. Well, I haven't said that in a week or two. You know, Ebon, I just don't say those words very much. But I know what they mean. Ebon is dark. And when you think of a piano, think of an old piano. It's got the white keys and the dark keys. Those dark keys on those old pianos are made out of ebony, a very dark wood. I see the dark keys on a piano when I hear that word ebon, okay? So it's dark. Now, a pinion is a feather, and here it's really a feathered wing. That's what a pinion is, okay? So, an ebon pinion, night with a dark wing. Okay, that still sounds a little strange, doesn't it? How does night have a dark wing? Well, keep reading here. Go. Night with ebon pinion brooded o'er the vale. Now, a vale, you know that's a little valley. Jesus sitting up here, the Mount of Olives, in the little Kidron Valley with Jerusalem. But night has settled down over this little valley, and it is dark. And that word brooded, that's used to describe the way a bird will spread her feathers out and cover her little nest up. She's brooding, you know. Okay, and that's what night is doing. But brooding also has to do with thinking deeply about something that is sorrowful, doesn't it? It's a perfect word to describe what had happened that night. I tell you, it was night. It was night. Remember when Judas betrayed Jesus and he left? John said that he went out and it was night. Well, that almost sounds like some spiritual implications here. When they came to arrest Jesus, he said, "This is your hour and the power of darkness." So it was physically dark that night, but spiritually too, there's evil afoot. And this is a dark night of evil that is occurring. So night with Ebon Pinion brooded o'er the vale. And then all around was darkness, save the night wind's wail. You ever heard the wind like that? You ever wake up in the night and heard that wind is just wailing as it goes by? I know what a wail is. A wail is like a mournful cry. We've heard the wind blow maybe around our house, or maybe hear the wind blowing up the holler, and it's just like a wail to hear that mournful wind through the night. And so he's capturing, in a poetic language here, he's capturing the mood of what is taking place in that garden. When Christ, the man of sorrows, well, that's what Isaiah said he would be, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, in tears and sweat and blood. Luke, the physician, is the one that tells us that his sweat became his drops of blood. You know what sweat is? You know, sweat is filtered blood. Did you know that? It's filtered through your skin, and that moisture dropping off of him, and he's sweating this way. It's not because it's hot and humid. That's not it. He's sweating this way because of the agony that is within him. Prostrate in the garden. Remember, he fell on his face. He is laid out in that garden. Here he is, just as low as the low can be. And as he's down low like that, what does he do? He lifts his voice to him that is as higher than the highest. Prostrate in the garden, raised his voice to God. Isn't that just beautiful? Now, smitten for offenses which were not his own. He, for our transgressions, now watch this, had to weep alone. No friend with words to comfort, nor hand to help was there. Remember that lonely verse? He left them asleep and went out and prayed the third time, saying the same words, all by himself. That's not exactly right. That's almost right. But one of the accounts talks about the angels that came and ministered to him. What a comfort that must have been, because no man was there to help. And the meek and lowly humbly bowed in prayer. And then he says, Abba, Father, Father. Matthew didn't tell us about Abba. That's recorded in the book of Mark. If you'll read Mark's account, Mark says, Abba, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Abba is not a word we use, but that's an Aramaic word. Aramaic was the language that people spoke. Now, they knew Greek, but usually in their conversations and all, the little local language was Aramaic. That's probably the language of Jesus' youth. And Abba, well, Abba is a very reverent and loving term for father. We have a word a lot like that in our language. It's Papa. You know, that sounds a lot, when you say that, there's just a lot of love and reverence and respect that goes with that word Papa, you know. So, Abba, Father. I don't want to take away from the mood here, but you know little babies, when they begin to speak, what they do, so I know what daddies do. So, see there, he's saying my name. See, they'd say that before they go, mama, mama. They go, abba. So that's probably where that word comes from. And so, Abba, he says, in this very reverent spirit, Abba, Father, Father, if indeed it may, let this cup of anguish, that's what Jesus is going to suffer, pass from me, I pray. Yet if it must be suffered by me, thine only Son. Those words, thine only Son, Carries me back to another very emotional scene. This comes from the Old Testament. God said to Abraham, "Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him for a sacrifice." When me, thine only son, Abba, Father, Father, let thy will be done. Last week when we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, we talked about how Jesus taught us to pray. Jesus taught us to pray, "Thy will be done." Pretty easy to hear that and say that. Look when Jesus did that. He shows us here that sometimes that's hard for us to pray, isn't it? To resign our will to God's will, even though we know this is going to be hard. But thy will be done. Okay, Mike, let's sing that song. If you will, turn in your songbook to number 207. In just a minute, Mike will lead us in this song. And if you're not baptized into Christ, then I want you to come forward and be baptized. Now, tell you what, before I do this, we stand for the invitation song. Stand for the invitation. Let's just stand. Now that you're standing, I want you to come forward to be baptized. And you might think, well, preacher, you don't understand really what I'm dealing with, and don't appreciate what I'm struggling with or how I feel. And you're probably right about that. But you see, Jesus understands this. He does. In fact, he understands. I turn to my Lord, I know. He understands how I feel even better than I understand how I feel. He says, but I know my weakness. And you don't understand that. And that's probably right when it comes to everyone else in here. But Jesus understands weakness. Didn't he just demonstrate that? And yet, with all the feelings that we feel, with all the weaknesses that we have, Jesus said, "Not my will, but thine be done." So he understands. And he still expects us to do his will. And he knows you can do that. So let that be in your heart. It's not my will. This is God's will. And if that be God's will, I'm going to come forward while we sing this song, and I'm going to be baptized into Christ. Mike?